Good morning. My name is Scott Litke, the director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. Welcome to our monthly Lunch and Learn program, our third Thursday IHE Lunch and Learn. Today, we are honored to have Łukasz Niparko, originally from Poland, a graduate student at UNO. He and I were introduced to each other through Dr. Ari Cohn a few years ago, and I've been fascinated by the work he is doing. And actually, if you are going to be coming to see any of the programs that are going to be three programs with Bach, tonight's program at 7 o'clock, Łukasz is the one who introduced us to the program and said, any way we could all do this. His presentation today is the Forgotten Jewish Atlantis, Poznań, Poland. I'll let him tell you more about his work. He will be a Ph.D., formally a Ph.D. In December, and we're very fortunate to welcome him here today. So I turn it over to you now. And if you are not on mute, please mute yourselves. And I'm going to do that right now. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. And please let me share my desktop with all of you. I hope you are able to see it. And I will click the presentation mode. So once again, thank you so much for having me here today and for coming to this lecture during lunchtime, during the summer break for some of you. It's also wonderful to see familiar faces. And when I'm not researching different aspects of my city, Poznań history, including the legacy of the Jewish community that marked the city in many ways and is continue to shaping the city today, I'm also studying civil society and how civil society impacts democracy. So I'm always very uplifted seeing people coming together just like you, people who choose to be active, who choose to be informed, to seek new knowledge or to familiarize themselves with something. And it's always remarkable to witness that, because as I will be mentioning a little bit later today, I strongly argue that this is the way to keep our democracy consolidated, healthy, and strong. So many atrocities, many violations to human rights, civil liberties can be also prevented when civil society is out there. But without further ado, let me take you to this journey that for me is very personal, and I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to that story. And as the Greek stories of Aesop and Greek philosophers teach us, the story is always about you. Regardless if we come from that place, there is always something that we can connect. And I hope that my lecture today will bring some connections, will connect some dots, and maybe help us understand certain processes and phenomena. I want to take you to the urban landscape that is not always on the surface. And I think many of you coming from Omaha and other places, it is always important for us to ask what was here before, or which people are not around anymore, or who was here before us, and think about this urban landscape as not something that it's only in front, but also underground and historically that was present in that space. I also want to put that history on trial in a way that very often when we think of the Polish Jewish history, we are taken in our lectures or our articles we read to places like Krakow, Kazimierz district, or Warsaw, or Łódź, Litzmannstadt, where we encounter this oftentimes painful but also marvelous legacy of Jewish culture and coexistence with people around. And oftentimes Poznań, which is in the western part of Poland, becomes omitted from that narrative. And in this presentation, I will tell you that it's also important to pay attention to that place for many reasons. And one of the most important reasons is that in the 16th century, it was the largest Jewish community in Poland at that time, and the cornerstone of something that we used to call at that time the Council of Four Lands, where Polish Jews from many corners of the Polish kingdom came together in their self-government. So again, civil society in its 16th century form that could flourish because of, among others, Poznań Jews. But I'll be also mentioning about today's time, about the legacy of anti-Semitism. And when I teach anti-Semitism courses and programs on anti-Semitism prevention, I always tell my students to not be easily fall into this trap that something started in 1933 with advent of some people to power and ended in 1945 with some people leaving those power positions. In fact, as you well know, anti-Semitism is the story of more than 1,000 years and marked Europe and the entire continent with representation in art, in the way we governed many places, the way Europeans expelled other Europeans who were not welcome and not considered as such. So it is a legacy of 1,000 years. But in this narrative I'm giving you today, it's also a story of 1,000 years. And just like we talked with Scott a moment ago about his trip to Warsaw, if you end up in Warsaw, there's a wonderful museum called Poland that tries to show the story of Polish Jews within 1,000 years perspective. And this is also my presentation today, to show the elements of coexistence, the elements that are put Jewish people into the situations of no one else would like to found themselves, the situations of pogroms, institutionalized anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that led to murders and extermination, but also the 1,000 years that marked coexistence, that mark the flourishing of communities and mark the possibility of rebuilding those communities today. And that's the work to do. As you recall, this title of lecture today, Atlantis, goes back to this mythical Greek city that perished underwater. And we can read many reiterations of that story. Some of them come, for example, with two dialogues by Plato, Timaeus and Critias, when he presents this very utopian city that was well organized, well governed, and yet it perished. And the story of Poznań, Atlantis, is very similar. It also connects to water that covered the building of the Poznań largest and most magnificent synagogue that was built in 1910 and then became in 1940s part of the Wehrmacht soldiers' entertainment landscape, where they were moving what was sacrum into profane by making that building a swimming pool for their soldiers. So literally, the Jewish Poznań became underwater city, also the city that became put underground because of the legacies of anti-Semitism, but also of the totalitarian regimes, starting with the Second World War and then continuing during the communist Poland until 1989. And I also want to use this chance to thank Professor Ari Cohen and Gerald Steinacker, who invited me to their edited volume, Anti-Semitism on the Rise, that was published recently at UNL, where I could actually present this story of Poznań Jews in a written form and publish it together with them. I'm also thankful to Scott, who a couple of years ago visited our programming on anti-Semitism prevention and delivered a remarkable speech that inspired young people at UNL to be upstanders themselves. Because I think the best choice we can make as listeners to this lecture, but as active members of community, is to acknowledge that the story of anti-Semitism unfortunately continues, that Atlantis that happened to Poznań is not an only instance in history, and those instances can continue, can repeat themselves if we are not coming together to prevent them. I also want to acknowledge in this moment Judith Goldstein, a leader of a network called Humanitarian Action. And if you're interested more in how you can become active person in preventing anti-Semitism, in human rights education, please Google after this meeting Humanitarian Action. It's a wonderful NGO that stems from this notion of never again. Judith Goldstein, just like many of us, were meeting people at lectures when we share our stories, when we share our research, and then we tell you those narratives, and oftentimes very tragic narratives of communities that cease to exist. And then we think, what to do next? Is my speech, is my talk really contributing to never again? And I hope yes, but I also want to follow people like Judith Goldstein, like Scott Lichtke, like Ari Cohen, who not only talk, but also do. And I hope this speech will be an invitation for all of you to also do something, because by doing, we can ensure that we are active participants in ensuring never again to be never again. Janusz Korczak, a famous Polish Jewish educator, wrote these words that we are the brothers and sisters of one earth, centuries of common good and bad, and a long journey together, one sun is shining for us. Janusz Korczak, with his pedagogy of empowering young people till his final moments in the concentration death camp, saw this hope for humanity, that humanity can come together except of separations, except of the past. And I share this optimism, though I also acknowledge that that optimism comes with certain limitation, especially when it has to be put in the relationship of persistent anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism that is being utilized by various politicians here and there who wanna time and again make people in opposite to each other, that wanna utilize some people as scapegoats. And unfortunately, in Poland that exists in its post-2015 reality, ruled by a very nationalistic party, this story of anti-Semitism is resurging also today. This is the Poznań New Synagogue that was opened in 1910, and here you can see on the left the picture from opening that synagogue in 1910 that gathered Jews from all over Poznań, but also from the greater Poland region, that Poznań is the capital, and many parts of Poland that didn't exist at that time, but the German Empire that Poland consisted of, the Poznań part, for 123 years. And on the right, you can see the synagogue today. As much as the Wehrmacht, when came to Poznań and incorporated the part of Poland where Poznań is located to the Third Reich, and as you might be familiar, the other parts were, for example, construed into the general government, they made this building as a part of their enterprise of violence, changing that into a swimming pool. And unfortunately, that tragedy, that profanity has not ended after the Second World War, because both the communist regime, but also the post-89 democratic regime kept that swimming pool open, and only in early 2000s returned this building to Jewish community. But then again, the building is returned in the shape of a total distraction, of total profanity, and Poznań Jewish community that consists of 70 people. So you can imagine the 2,800 people that lived in Poznań in 1939 who identified as Jews, now it's only 70 people. Of course, they couldn't lift the burden of having to rebuild or to whatever do with that place to either commemorate it or renovate it. So it is still like this till today, till 2023. This building is crying for its dignity, for respect to be given back to this once most wonderful synagogue of Poznań and one of the most beautiful in Poland. So if you're interested in that story, please also feel free to reach out to me. I can also put you in touch with people who are thinking of how to properly move forward and how to give back this space of Jewish history and Jewish culture to its righteous spot within the city. This is the picture from last week. Actually, the synagogue, due to the electrical malfunctioning, got on fire. So again, it was a reminder to the Poznań community that we need to act, we need to help our Jewish brothers and sisters to together make this place again something that makes us all proud, and to also commemorate this tragic history of anti-Semitism and totalitarianism that made this place into what it is today. I myself went to an art installation that happened in Poznań synagogue in 2006. I was a teenage person back then, and I was shocked by this art installation that put the Star of David on the water within the swimming pool that wasn't functioning at that time, but was a reminiscence of what anti-Semitism and hatred did to the Jewish community. And that was the striking moment to me when I become asking the questions, where are the Jews of Poznań? What happened to the other synagogues? What happened to other places that this community for thousands of years was building? And those answers will be touched upon during this lecture. So as you will be familiar after my talk today, Poznań is located in the western part of Poland. It is the fifth in terms of the size, but the second in terms of GDP in Poland. It's a very important hub right at the crossroads between east and west. And it is a city that was always in this kind of multicultural zone of exchange of ideas, exchange of people, exchange of also coexistence, and making that a strength, not a weakness, something that we should be time and again reminded. I always like to tell my American audiences that before you were the melting pot, we were the melting pot. And look where Poland is today, from a multi-ethnic place to a homogeneous country of 90+% of people who identify themselves as ethnic Poles, who have the similar creed and who look more or less the same. So the melting pot scenario can always shift if we don't also stand up for atrocities and hatred that is around us. This is the painting that depicts the founding of Polish statehood in 966. And that painting is a very nationalistic and also very rooted in religiosity of Christianity. And that's the purpose of the painter, Jan Matejko. He, by purpose, omits a very important part of this painting that should be present. The Jewish community that arrived in 965 with the spouse of the Polish prince that you can see on this painting is touching the cross. Her name was Dobrawa, and she came to Poznań, where the Polish statehood started, with her court, including Jewish persons. So the first kind of official moment we can see the presence of Jewish people in Poznań, in Poland, is the 965, 966, the very beginning of Polish statehood. But as you can see on this painting, that statehood got rooted in Christianity. The Christendom that Poland became part of and kind of wanted to root itself in the Roman version of it in opposition to the Eastern reiterations of Christianity was the choice that the monarchs did. But also those monarchs saw the importance at that time of coexistence of many people together, something that in Europe at that time was quite unique. So you might be wondering, like, why by the time the Second World War happened, so many Jews lived in Poland. It was the legacy of the choice of the Polish king to not only be rooted in Christianity, but also rooted in openness to others. And that was quite unique, but that didn't shield people from committing atrocities against each other. So there is stories of pogroms, there is stories of violence, oftentimes orchestrated by Catholic Church itself, when in the 12th century we have the gathering of the Polish clergy in a place called Wrocław. There was a demand and pressure made on the Polish monarchs to ask Jewish people to organize in what we would call today ghettos. There was this push for keeping the community of Jews in separation from the Christianity. But the Polish monarchs at that time saw certain vision in keeping the society multicultural and taking the Jewish people under the royal jurisdiction. And that was something special for that time and rooted the future of Poland as a state that was welcoming Jewish people. But of course, the welcoming is one story, and the coexistence that it's oftentimes paved with many tragedies, it's a different story. And this is the landscape of Polish population in the post-Second World War and post-communism reality, with, as I mentioned, 93% who are more or less alike. Something that makes also the story of Atlantis very hard to search for, because on one hand, you have people who are passionate about looking for the Jewish past, who are looking for their Jewish heritage, who want to see the urban landscape as not only telling the story of 93%, but also the story of a melting pot that was there before the Second World War and throughout 1,000 years of existence. But then there's also many people who choose nationalism as their agenda. So since 2015, we are ruled by the party that is rooting itself in nationalism, in this kind of vision of Poland for ethnic Poles, for one religion, and that's not much helpful in terms of bringing the Atlantis back to surface, though please rest assured there are people who are committed to that and who are trying to ensure that the Jewish Renaissance that kind of started in Poland after '89 continues. But oftentimes they are a very small, wounded by totalitarianism communities. As I said, in 1939 in Poland, in Poznań, we have 2,800 Jews. In 2000s of the 20th century, and now we have about 70 people who are active members of the Jewish community, the so-called Jewish gmina, as we say in Poland. And that word gmina stems actually from the medieval times, where the Jews were able in Poland to settle and to organize their communities, their civil society, under the direct jurisdiction of the Polish monarch. This is the heart of Poznań, the old market square. And that market square was built in 1253 when the medieval city was established on the right bank of the Warta River, which is splitting Poznań into two halves, the left and right. In the early medieval times, the settlement, the first Jewish presence was on the left bank, and in 1253 it moved to the right bank. And this painting shows certain story, shows architecture, shows people, but the people here are the most important, because if we zoom into this painting, we, for example, will be able to see Akiva Eger, one of the most magnificent rabbis of Poznań, who was very well versed in Talmud and one of the top scholars at that time in Europe in Talmudic studies. So this is a different painting than the one you saw by Jan Matejko. This is the painting that shows multicultural, multi-ethnic Poznań, something that maybe many of people today would like to not see and not to put as their political agenda, but we cannot forget that the story of Poland is a story of multi-ethnicity, and it's so easy to erase that because of totalitarian regimes, because of anti-Semitism. But being upstander for the full picture, for the paintings like that of Juliusz Knorr that show the multi-ethnicity and the value in it and the beauty in it, it's also something I take on my personal agenda to show to my colleagues in Poznań, to my students also in Poznań, to keep them reminded that we once were a wonderful community, of course, with many issues too, but the multi-ethnicity was its strength. And when the Second World War happened and this place, the very place from the painting start to look like that, it also was cleansed from multi-ethnicity. And as I said, Poznań became part of the Third Reich, so also many ethnic Poles were moved to other parts of Poland that became part of the general government under Hans Frank. This part of Poland became under the leadership of Arthur Greiser, and the Jews were the first, again, to be prosecuted and persecuted. By the end of December 1939, there was no Jews in this once what it was the largest Jewish community in the 16th century. They were all evicted, put in trains to different concentration and death camps, and most of the Poznań Jews perished in Kulmów, what is in Polish Chełmno nad Nerem. But I want to also tell you the story that it's not limited to the Second World War, to these connections that stem from ancient to Renaissance to today's time. And we sometimes think of ourselves living in the 2023 as so connected, so global. And yet, let's be reminded that we used to be global in the past too. In fact, maybe we used to coexist sometimes even better, in a better terms than today. And as you saw the painting from the Polish statehood origins, one of the first chroniclers to write about Polish establishment at that time was Ibrahim ibn Jacob. And here comes a very interesting story. He was working for the Khanate of Cordoba in today's Spain, but was also a Sephardic Jew, traveling through Christian Europe and working for the Muslims. So those fascinating connections and many stories like that through another person connected to Poznań, Gaspar da Gama, who being a Jew himself works for the Islamic community, then joins Vasco da Gama on the way to India and dies there making the discoveries for the geography, but also what we would say today, furthering certain colonial agenda. But we were on equal terms part of making that history, and the Jewish community had enormous contribution. The European history is the history of Jewish community, the, as many people say, Judeo-Christian one. But I want to make it a little pause here. We put it Judeo-Christian legacy, and colleague of mine always like to say that that dash is a very complicated dash because it bears pogroms, it bears extermination, it bears so much that Christians inflicted on their Jewish neighbors. But as I said, before the Second World War happened, it was the place of somewhat flourishing, of somewhat maverick, that many people escaping the pogroms and expulsions from Britain, from Spain, could find refuge in the Polish kingdom. And to affirm that, the Statute of Kalisz of the Bolesław the Pious was the first document that Polish monarchy issued for its Jewish population. And that happened in 1264 with 36 articles that gave appreciation to the Jewish civil society, that led Jewish people to live and flourish under the jurisdiction of Polish monarch. And of course, there are certain limitations here. Every history has its origin, purpose, value, and limitation, like why the Polish monarchs are so nice. They also want to see certain benefits that come from that multiculturalism, coming with taxation, coming from making certain profits that come with the Jewish community that is actually contributing so much to the GDP. When we look at the GDP of Poznań throughout history, it was not only 20% of Jewish population that lived there, but almost 46% of GDP that was generated by that population. So the monarchs are not only make so-called noble choice, but also very versed in benefit choice to welcome the people and to take care of them in the best way possible. But sometimes they also had to protect them from the church and from their own people, or what we would call subjects at that time. And that wasn't easy, because the legacy of anti-Semitism, and many of you who will go to European Museum and see a painting, for example, from that time, will see this representation of the church as a personification of something good, and on the other side of painting, the synagogue as personification of something wicked. How horrifying that paintings are, but they just show the certain way of European Christendom thinking and portraying Jewish community as such, as something wicked. And the Polish king, living in a state that is so rooted in Christianity, had to oftentimes balance between the clergy that was very powerful, immensely powerful in that state. Unfortunately, that power also stems to today's world, to today's Poland, where the church still plays a very important role in Polish society today. But at that time, they need to also balance the protection for the Jews, but also catering to the clergy that was immensely powerful. But that loss of Bolesław the Pious were later extended to the entire Poland, beyond the Poznań region, to everyone and every subject of the Polish king. And that king was Casimir the Great, hence the part of Krakow named Kazimierz, that was a Jewish district within the city. And again, on this painting by Wojciech Gerson, you can see representation of Jews coming from other parts of Europe and being welcome in Poland. Welcomed by king, but not oftentimes by their neighbors. And here is the today's Google Map satellite picture from the Polish Poznań Jewish district. And on the top, the gray building is a former new synagogue that was destroyed by the Nazis and continue used as a swimming pool by the communist regime and early post-1989 democratic regime. You can still see on the Google map, it says aquatic, which is so horrifying to see that we also as a democratic Poland let this happen. But again, we let it maybe happen because anti-Semitism is so prevalent throughout history of Poland and Europe as such. And because of the influence of the clergy, The Jews were confined to this few streets, to the Jewish quarter of Poznań that became flourishing, but also became very crowded, hence many fires throughout history, many fires that potentially were inspired not only by atmospheric conditions, but also by the very neighbors. Oftentimes there are accounts in history, for example, from 16th century, where the clergy led the processions of crowd of the Christians to march through the Jewish district of Poznań, and those marches didn't involve prayers only, but oftentimes also beatings and resulted in pogroms. And as much as colorful and nice this medieval Poznań looks like, it is possible on one hand to look so nice because of coexistence of different people, but also these nice stories meant troublesome events for Jewish community. For example, in 1399, we have an account of this most horrifying and yet so common for European accusation of blood libel, where the Jewish community was accused of, in this case, stealing the body of Jesus from the church and then also kidnapping Christian boys and violating them, and you know, all this horrifying, untrue fake news, we would say today, but those fake news resulted in pogroms, in murders, in violations of bodily integrity of Jews inhabiting Poznań, to the extent that, for example, in 1556, Polish king had to reprimand Poznań Christians and say, like, people, you cannot do that. You need to coexist, and I am enshrining anti-libel laws. If I hear something like that, I will be unhappy and I will call you to the royal court, because that just portrays the extent to which those accusations, those pogroms were present in a daily reality, that Jews persisted, that Jews, despite all of that, were able to create their own strong community, gmina, so wealthy in terms of culture, tradition, with the Talmudic school Landej Pozna, with the outstanding rabbis that were inspiring the entire European Jewish community, and made Poznań as a part of the Council of Four Lands, where they lead the leadership role. But all of that happens simultaneously with stories like that, where they are accused and persecuted. And unfortunately, this fresco portraying this 1399 story is still in a church in Poznań, and there is not much incentive from the church leadership to at least explain that this is just a confabulation, untrue, that this is anti-Semitic, fake. They don't want to do it till now. But also more and more people are aware that those stories are just pure anti-Semitism. And that pure anti-Semitism had very good fertile ground when Poland, after 123 years, regained independence, when the Polish nationalism became a cornerstone of the rebuilt Second Republic between 1918 and 1939. The Jews at that time were seen as a foreign element, and that's so untrue, and that's so against the historiography, because I've been just telling you, they've been there for 1,000 years, and they are part of Poznań legacy. So why some people in the 20th of the 20th century so easily were able to scapegoat them and to utilize them as an answer to their misfortune, or as a tool to build nationalism. And here comes the story of the partitions and the way the Poznań Jewish community was unfortunately played by the people who were in power. So first, they were able to operate in the quasi-peacefulness guaranteed by the Polish monarchs. But then, when in Europe we reach Jewish enlightenment, Haskalah, and the Jewish community is looking for citizenship, for equal rights, they approach the Polish king and say, okay, for so many hundreds of years, we've been cherishing these rights that were quite progressive in comparison to the rest of Europe, but now it's time for Haskalah also here. It's time to embrace the full citizenship, because we were denied that citizenship only reserved to Christians. That also translated to, for example, business, when the different guilds within medieval or Renaissance Poznań were only reserved to the Christians. And the Polish kings had no answer to that. They didn't want to give more than what they did give before, and especially give the citizenship. That's why where Poland collapses with the three partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795, and Poznań becomes part of the Prussia Empire, the German statehood sees this as an opportunity. They seize this amazing potential in Jewish community and tell them, now you are equal. Now you are citizens. Now you are equal part of the city landscape, regardless of what's your creed and what's your denomination. And most of the Poznań Jews, righteously so, made a very wise and regular choice that we probably all of us would do, to acquire the citizenship, to become part of the Prussian Empire, and to some extent cut this legacy of the Polish monarchical support that enshrined them legally for hundreds of years. That's why when Poland regained independence in 1918, thanks to Woodrow Wilson's support, and after the aftermath of the First World War, many of Poznań Jews didn't feel Polish. They felt like something is going on their eyes and they're not part of it, and they were afraid that the Polish statehood that was just reborn will embrace this vision of a Pole as an ethnic person, as a Christian person, and there will be not much space for them. So most of them actually escape to the territorial Germany at that time. But history never likes vacuum, and the industry that was left behind by Poznań Jews was populated by the other Jews coming from the eastern part of reborn Poland, because traditionally till today, the eastern part of Poland is less economically privileged, is more a rural community. So those people could see opportunities in the richer and more advanced economically West. But again, they were feeling not as always at their home. Their neighbors not always seen them as someone who've been there for decades. And that again led to this fertile ground that the anti-Semites of nationalism could really tap into. And as you know, that also facilitates what comes later, with so many Jewish people not being saved, being denounced, being given away by their ethnic Polish neighbors to the German Nazi perpetrators who contributed to their ultimate demise and perishing from the city landscape. In Poznań, that was a little bit different than in the eastern part of Poland or other places in the general government, because, as I said, it ultimately became part of the Third Reich. So by the December of 39, Poznań Jews were evicted to the death camps and other ghettos that were established, for example, in Litzmannstadt, in today's Łódź. So the Nazi occupiers cleansed once what it was so flourishing community. And there is one account of one person hiding throughout the war, but again, most likely on his own and with not much support. But also many of those ethnic Poles were removed by the occupiers to other part of Poland because they wanted to see it as a purely German city that later was bombed and destroyed during the advent of the Soviet army to the west. But on the left side, there is something that also portrays this constant trauma that Jews were placed by the political regimes, either or monarchs or the presidents of Polish or German governments. This is a train station in a little town near Poznań named Bąszyn. Because as I told you, many of these Poznań Jews, once Poland regained independence, went westward to Berlin, to other places, because they felt more connection. They felt that they are, in fact, German. And when in 1938, Polish president decided to make a decree to strip those who are not on the territory of Poland from their citizenship, the Third Reich government, the Nazi government, utilized it and ordered, in adherence to the Nuremberg laws, the Jewish escapees from Poznań to be evicted from Germany. They were dropped in a little train station in Bąszyn, close to Poznań, and many of them, as refugees, were living in that limbo all the way to the 1st September of 1939, where the war began. And there's one account from that time when someone says that suitcase not always signify a journey, that suitcase can also be a symbol of oppression, of Holocaust. And as many of you might visited death camps, there's sometimes those collections of suitcases that people came with. And so the Poznań Jews oftentimes had to put all of their belongings or their lives to one suitcase and either move westward or back eastward to perish, for example, in the death camp, but also to show time and again how they became a subject to this history game of anti-Semitism, of totalitarianism that oftentimes repeats itself. And as you're aware, the territory of today's Poland and other parts that are not anymore part of Poland became a landscape of extermination camps, of death camps, and the Poznań Jews ended their existence as a community mostly in Chełmno, in what is called Kulmhof. But some people survived, and I said 70 of them constituted the post-Second World War reality. But that reality ended up in a new totalitarianism of the communist Poland. Communist Poland that in 1968, using the Nazi rhetoric, decided to blame the misfortune of the economy and political unrest time and again on Jews. And many people escape Poland right away, fearing that the history will happen again, that the pogroms will start again, that the concentration camps might rematerialize. And many of Poznań Jews who survived, the 70 of them also decided to leave. Some of them were returning, especially after the 1989, to showcase that they know their roots, but they also cannot find their place anymore in this Atlantis, in this city landscape that perish underwater. That's why when the totalitarian regime ended in 1989, more and more people started to acknowledge the past, started to ask the question, is there everyone here? Oh no, not everyone is here. Actually, the 20% of Poznań landscape is gone. It's not here anymore. And where is this landscape? So different lovers of history, the members of reborn Jewish community started to come together as a civil society under the leadership of this wonderful woman, Alicja Kobus, who given her entire life to make the Poznań Jewish community being reborn again after the 1989. It is a community of less than 100, but with enormous legacy. And that legacy stems from different people. And I know I'm running out of time, but you can chat with me later. Scott has my email, and I'm also happy to tell you more about, for example, Gaspar de Gama, the Poznań Jew, who is believed to contribute to discovery of Brazil and the roads to India, of the Rabbi Judah Loben Batzalel, who later in Prague created the mythical golem, or of the great sociologist from Poznań, Zygmunt Bauman, who in 1968 had to escape Poland because Jews became the scapegoat back then again. And to conclude, let me finish with this picture that I think gives us some hope that we can also find in the complicated history. This is a sculpture done by the German sculptor Wackerle, showcasing the German migrants to Poland, but the model to that sculpture was a Polish woman, Jadwiga Gadziemska, and that sculpture was committed by an owner of a Jewish enterprise and restaurants and hotel, Leopold Goldenring. So this one sculpture shows the certain coexistence of Jews from centuries that live in Poland, personified by someone who is Polish, sculpted by someone who is German, and showcasing the Jewish prosperity of Poznań, which I hope is coming again to the city landscape by the people who want to see Poland as a melting pot again. Thank you so much for your attention and time.
Thank you. That was incredible. Actually, I'm going to spend a day at the Poland Museum in Warsaw while I'm there next month, so I'm excited everything I hear about it. My question, I'm going to ask the first question, then see if we have others. Currently, from the statistics I've seen, they say there's about 6,000 Jews in Poland today. Are most of those Jews people who trace their roots through Poland, or are they new immigrants to Poland to help reestablish Jewish life in Poland? Would you happen to know?
This is a very good question, and I also have to acknowledge that the 6,000 people continue oftentimes to live in the landscape of anti-Semitism or landscape of not being welcome. That's also perpetuated by the current government that might not always welcome, for example, research on the history of Polish Jews, that sometimes the ethnic Poles played not so bright chapters. So this is important to mention, but also important to say that they are part now of the so-called Polish Jewish Renaissance that we can observe after '89. And after '89, many of those people who were living in Poland throughout communism and their children decided to embrace their heritage, because living in the shade of 1968, when the communists blamed the Jews for all the misfortune of their regime, put this kind of lesson to the Polish Jews: we should not maybe speak up, we should not acknowledge our past. So much have happened to us, then maybe if we don't acknowledge that, we will be able to live peacefully. But once the political regime of communism ended, they saw this new opening, that maybe it's the time to be again who we are, to go back to the roots. Also, the Polish government at that time tried to reinstitute some of the Jewish property. As many of you might know, not all of that is ended. Actually, the reinstitution of Jewish property to the Jewish owners is still a big issue and big problem, and there's lack of the willingness of Polish government to do so. But there are also fascinating stories of this transgenerational realization of people's roots. And the personification of that story is Rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudrich. He is born in New York City, and he has a flyover stop in Warsaw on his way to Israel. And he gets out of the plane, is supposed to catch another plane to Tel Aviv in few hours, and he watches this view behind the airport, and he thinks of his roots, of his Polish Jewish legacy inside him. And he says, I'm not embarking the next flight. I'm staying here. I will be part of the Jewish Renaissance where they flourished for centuries. I don't want this to be only legacy of anti-Semitism, of pogroms and Holocaust. I want this to be a live community, because by doing that, this is the biggest slap on the face of all those haters, of all those people who want people to vanish, perish, and be destroyed. And Michael Szudrych is till now in Warsaw running a wonderful Jewish community, as you say, of 6,000 people. And I think there are many stories like that, and that's very inspiring.
Thank you. I actually had a chance to hear him speak a few years ago when I lived in DC. It's fascinating. Steve Weiss had a question. He said, on the current photograph, the photograph you had just shown before of the old Jewish synagogue, it seemed that there was a partially obliterated marking on the front. What did it say?
That's a very good question, because there is a certain competition between those who still spray the Maseva stones of Jews with anti-Semitic words and those who spray them with some other graphics. So if I can show you the one in front of the synagogue, it's just some doodling by the teenagers that shows the total profanity. You know, those people who put those markings on the synagogue, they don't know what this place was and about all the tragedy that this building personifies. It shows that the dozens of years under totalitarian regime and in post-89 Poland that sometimes choose to only cater to 93% and forgets about its minorities and about the melting pot narrative, make people to be able to put whatever random things on the synagogue. So those are the non-anti-Semitic markings, but the doing of that is anti-Semitic because it shows that lack of respect to this building. And sometimes they are anti-Semitic words or symbols put on the synagogue. But you might also be wondering about the other drawing in front of the synagogue here, which means I miss you, Jew. It's written by one of the Poznań artists, and many artists, many people who want to embrace the full history of Poland, the history of melting pot, put those kind of food for thought for their fellow Poles when they cross the street and they see, I miss you, Jew, so they can miss with them this wonderful community that contributed to Poznań prosperity. The fact that Poznań is today the second in terms of Polish GDP, it's because of legacy of community that was strong, entrepreneurial, and organized because of its Jewish population. And righteously so, this person says, I miss you, Jew.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. Dana, please go ahead. You got to take your stuff off mute, please.
My grandparents were born in 1899 in Poland, one in Zagłazda and one in Monastyrzyczka. Are those near Poznań?
I'm not sure I recall those names properly, but there is this kind of legacy of different settlements. And most of the Polish Jews lived in the places called shtetls, the little towns where they could actually flourish economically. And those places sound like those little towns, and they could be around Poznań region, but they can also be in other parts of Poland. Why is so? Because in those little towns, it was easier for them to compete. Because in the big city like Poznań, there is a very strong, for example, medieval or Renaissance guilds of craftsperson, of merchants, and also the very strong bishop oftentimes, who doesn't want to see the religious minority under its neighborhood. And those people chose those small communities because the merchandise, the guilds were not that strong, that excluded Jews from them, and they could flourish there. But that's why I think the Jews of Poznań are remarkable in a way that they were able to prevail against all of those hardships. And as much as the places you mentioned sound like the shtetls, like a smaller places where Jews inhabited, they are part of the fabric. They are part of the 1,000 years fabric of Jews living in Poland. And this fabric has also global connections. When I was visiting Shanghai many years ago, I traveled through Shanghai ghetto, and I saw a familiar picture that someone brought with them to Shanghai ghetto to escape the European Holocaust. And I saw Jews from Poznań on that picture of Günter Kamm, who brought with him the picture of Poznań. And I was crying and tearing up that in Shanghai, there are those traces, those global links. And I think regardless of where our ancestors live, we are all connected in the legacy of hate, but also legacy of cooperation. And I think, thank you for asking that. And if you wanna maybe look into those roots, I can help you also with looking for translations or connecting you to the people who might be of more help in tracing those two places in today's Poland.
Gosh, thank you so much. You're an amazing educator. I love listening to you, and I love the immense detail. It's very enlightening for us. Thank you very much for being here today. Next month, we also have another Nebraska connection. We have Dr. Chad Gibbs, who did his master's degree at UNO and is a professor in North Carolina right now. And he is, I met him actually online through connecting his research on Treblinka with the Polanski family from here in Omaha. And he is going to be speaking to live and to tell resistance at Treblinka and its legacies. And I know it will also be very enlightening. I thank you all for being here today, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you. And
thank you so much for having me. It meant a lot. And just 1 second, I quickly reread the question of Stephen in the chat. So those obliterated markings were actually assigned the municipal swimming pool. That's what it was written, and then the sign was removed. So that portrays the tragedy, the Atlantis of that place.
Thank you for the clarification. And I will see you all soon.